My name's Courtland. I created the Indie Hackers community, which is a large online community of mostly developers, but all sorts of folks who I would say mostly just like want some sort of control and freedom in their life. Most indie hackers are kind of like me. They don't like having a boss. They would much rather be the person who gets to decide what they work on, and they want to have an unlimited cap on how much money they can make if they bring a lot of value to the world, and they want to work on their own schedule, and so on and so forth. And so Indie Hackers is a community where these people can come together and exchange ideas and talk about their challenges and problems, and more than anything, just get inspired by each other's stories. So that's the whole idea behind the community, is that I try to find the best stories and surface them to everybody else. And I think when you hear stories of somebody else who's just, doing something amazing and something that you want for yourself, it really lights a fire under your ass and helps you, get out of bed in the morning and do what you've always dreamed of doing. So I started that back in 2016, and it was acquired by Stripe, where I continue to work on it in 2017. And before Indie Hackers, my background was as kind of a serial entrepreneur and a software engineer. So I have a degree in computer science from MIT. I was in the Y Combinator class of 2011, winter 2011, and I started 4 different SaaS companies with middling amounts of success up until Indie Hackers.
Hi, Courtland. It's nice to meet you. I'm a big fan of Indie Hackers. So I'm speaking from Pakistan, and I'm working on a Pinterest of code. So there's also kind of community aspect to it as well. And so kind of really interested in what I love about Indie Hackers is how welcoming it is, versus Reddit or Twitter, where you always you post and you're worried you're waiting for someone to attack you.
Yeah.
And you feel that with Indie Hackers, you post, there's going to just help, exactly what you want. And so I'm kind of wondering, did that happen organically, or did you do something? How did you create such an incredible community?
First of all, cool room. I like where you're at. Looks like a very fancy library type vibe there. And also cool idea, the Pinterest for code ideas is interesting. I was actually very worried about community friendliness and camaraderie in the beginning, because the Indie Hackers community was seeded by people from the Hacker News community. And the Hacker News community is ruthless. I can't imagine a place online where you're more likely to get criticized and shut down if you post your passion project or something you've been working on than Hacker News, because the culture there is one of contrarianism. You get upvoted to the top, not by agreeing and building on what people before you have said, but by finding the one flaw in their logic or the one flaw in their reasoning. And what's kind of cool about that is that it allows you to see both sides. You can read an article on Hacker News, and then the first comment's going to disagree, and the next comment's going to disagree with that comment. And it just gets you it's a very easy way to be educated as a reader. But it's not good when people post their projects, because you don't want people to crap all over your project and rain on your parade when you spend so much time working on it. And when it is a minimum viable product and it's not supposed to be perfect. And so I think in a way, the negative culture there and in other places influence people to make bad decisions is entrepreneurs and founders, because it makes them feel like they need to build something that's bulletproof and great, when really you should be sharing it in kind of a safe space where people understand that your first draft is your first draft, and it's not supposed to be great. And it's actually strategically better to make it really simple and dirty and focus on the basics. So what ended up happening, and I take no credit for this whatsoever, was that Indie Hackers had a much more empathetic and understanding community, simply because the only people interested in joining Indie Hackers were makers and builders themselves. Hacker News has so many people who just haven't created anything and who aren't creating anything. And the peanut gallery, they're just less empathetic because they've never been in the trenches before. Versus Indie Hackers, pretty much 100% of people who create an account and post on the site are actually doing something. And the people who aren't doing things yet are not doing it because they're a little bit scared to. So they're perhaps the most empathetic people who are the least likely to criticize because they're afraid of being criticized. So usually it's pretty supportive, and there's lots of different little groups and communities within Indie Hackers that are designated places just for posting something, getting feedback, and then paying it forward and giving other people feedback.
Yeah, that's incredible. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Misha.
Hey, it's incredible to see you live. I always hear the podcast and your voice. So I'm curious about how your perspective on Indie Hacker changed after you got acquired by Stripe. I mean, you were telling all this story that you want to build a business, be independent, be a founder, have no cap in your salary, and now you're back to employee.
Yeah.
How did you change things? Are you still excited, or do you want to run away at some point to something else?
It's funny because it actually made me much more ambitious than I ever was, which is ironic. You would think that not being an employee would have made me the most ambitious, and being an employee would have shrunk, constrained the scope of my vision, but the exact opposite happened. And I'll get into some of the details. So when I started Indie Hackers, I had spent 6-7 years in Silicon Valley. You know, I'd gone through YC. All my friends were basically YC founders or high growth tech startup founders. And like everything is like, go for $1 billion, change the world. You can do it. There's very little respect for like, take a small first step and see where you get. And after going that route, like I was inspired, and I really respect a lot of people who are doing that. But at the same time, like, I was just tired of trying to do that myself. I thought, you know, I could be doing this until I'm 40 and just genuinely never succeed. And then like I would be embarrassed and I'd feel bad about myself. And like, I just don't want to get there. So you know what? I just need like a quick win. I need something that can like pay my rent, just like pay my rent, pay my cell phone bill, let me afford health insurance, get me to the point where I'm just stable. And then I can figure out what I want to do next. And Indie Hackers was kind of, in a very meta way, not only a project to help inspire others to do that, but also to like help me get there. And so about 6-7 months after I started Indie Hackers, I had enough sponsorship revenue to actually do that. I was bringing in like $6,500-7,000 a month in sponsorship revenue, and it wasn't super hard to get there. Just like a few emails and phone calls, which were quite frankly pretty pleasant. Doing sales is much less scary than I thought it would be. And then Patrick Collison from Stripe emailed me out of the blue. Like, it wasn't even on my radar this could happen. They were actually at the very top of my sponsors list, like dream sponsor. I was going to reach out to them last after I like perfected my pitch to everybody else. But he emailed me first and was like, hey, can we buy Indie Hackers? And we got brunch and felt each other out a little bit. And I was like, yeah, this guy's smart and on the up and up. And I guess he thought the same about me. And so, you know, when we were talking, we were kind of talking about our vision for Indie Hackers. And I was a little embarrassed because I was like, my vision is to pay my rent. With Stripe, it's like, we're trying to, you know, raise the GDP of the internet and change it. Know it. Like, oh yeah. That's my step two. And I think he really challenged me to see some of the value inherent in Indie Hackers that like I was ambiently aware of, but when you're in the trenches and you're just like, you know, an operator every day, like writing code, making sales calls, like it's easy to lose track of kind of the bigger vision. And I think he helped me develop a bigger vision, which I had already had. Like I was already saying on my podcast and writing in my post, but I just hadn't really concretized it yet, which is like, I just want to inspire more people to do this thing. I think the world is changing and more people can do it. And it's easier than ever and more lucrative than ever and more fulfilling than ever. And if I can do that, like I'll be happy. And it's not even what I expected going into it. Like I just was totally 100% in it for myself at the beginning. And so now it's like my ambitions are much grander than they've ever been. I'm much more plugged into like the actual impact that Indie Hackers has on people's lives. Like hearing a story of a stranger on the internet who sat down in, you know, their basement and coded something up, and now they're making $3 million a year and doing all sorts of stuff. And like, that's crazy inspiring. And people make actual life-changing decisions based on stories that they've heard on the Indie Hackers podcast or read on the forum, which blows my mind to actually see people's like entire lives being changed. So ironically, yeah, as an employee, I have a much grander scope in my vision. I can't get into the details of how I'm compensated at Stripe, but it's almost like I'm running a high growth startup and Stripe is an investor in it. And so I don't feel like an employee. And I have this whole other theory about how pretty much every employee is a business anyway. Like if you're getting paid by somebody to do something, then like your business and you're selling them a product or a service. Mm-hmm. And if you're an employee, you're just selling the service of like your time and your skills to just one customer who's your employer. And besides that, everything else is the exact same as any other business. Like you can negotiate with your employer to raise your prices if you want, just like a business owner can raise their prices, and you can potentially find other customers, and you can, you know, walk away and fire your customers if you don't like them. And so I think it's not like so bad being an employee. Like I don't have anything wrong with it. I just think that you should, you know, if you're going to go that route, you should look at yourself as a business, and you should really try to understand the value that you provide to your customer/employer. And you should really be willing to negotiate and willing to differentiate yourself from like the rest of the competition, which is basically everybody else with your job title, so that you're uniquely valuable and it's hard for your customers to like not, you know, basically pay for what you're providing. And I think there's lots of people like that and lots of companies whose job titles like you might not have heard of, and there's not like open positions on job sites for them, but like they're making usually a lot more money and they're a lot more plugged into the value that they're delivering, and they feel like they have a lot more control over their lives. So it's not so bad to be an employee, but like I don't think one should have an employee mindset once you understand the kind of business founder mindset.
I was just curious, you know, I just launched my business. How did you get started? How did you let the world know that you exist, and how did you grow the community?
Yeah. First of all, I love your product idea. I need that. I'm in like the middle of a sugar addiction the last couple of weeks, where I just start like eating
Perfect.
the worst stuff, and I just like I have like a bag of Twizzlers in my cupboard right now. So I need your thing. How do you get the word out? This is a tough challenge. It was particularly tough for me because I am like a developer's developer. I love coding. After spending like years starting lots of companies, I picked up an eye for design, and I love design too. And so like, I just want to work on the product all day. I just want to sit down and build stuff. And unfortunately, product is only like one part of a business. You also have to figure out how to distribute and like get the word out. And that's a crucial part of your business. And it doesn't matter if you build the world's best product. If you don't have the word out there, like no one's going to use it. And this is a failure mode that people go into time and time again. But with Indie Hackers, I was basically like kind of fed up with myself. I had taken like a year off work because I'd been doing some contracting on the side of my projects. And I just took a year off, and I'm like, I'm going to start something. I'm going to make enough money to pay my rent. And like the first 6 months, I did the same thing that I had always done, which is just like code a cool, shiny project that I thought would be cool, with no plan of how to get the word out, no plan of how to advertise it or get people using it or any sort of viral growth, strategy. And I knew better than that. I've been doing this for so many years, and I just kind of like let my emotions guide me. And so I scrapped everything I'd been working on, and I sat down and I decided that I was going to have the willpower and the discipline to work basically backwards, like work distribution first, which is what I had known, like logically, if you'd asked me, I'd say, oh, of course you do distribution first. But like my behavior didn't reflect what I actually knew. And I'd spent a lot of time actually giving advice to other friends that I wasn't myself following. And so when I sat down, I just made like kind of a checklist. Okay, here's, the first thing that matters is kind of like, who is my audience and like what problem do they have that I'm trying to solve for them? And then beyond that, like I try to understand, okay, what is my audience like? What do they care about? What are they savvy about? What do they dislike? Where do they hang out? Just like really getting to know my audience, which for me ended up being very easy because my audience was people just like me. It was people who were aspiring and like founders and who were engineers who spent a lot of time on Hacker News, who really liked to read other stories from people, but who had trouble finding these stories online because they just were pretty rare and they often weren't well told. So I would scour Hacker News and just look at the places where people would like post a comment about how they created their profitable SaaS business. And like half the time they wouldn't share their revenue numbers. Half the time they wouldn't talk about how they found their first users. They're just missing all these like important details, which you just asked me about. Like the detail you asked me about Indie Hackers is exactly the detail that like everybody wants to hear about these stories once they've actually tried it and figured out that distribution and growth is hard. So I spent a lot of time just not coding anything and just reading stories and reading people's comments and reactions to them and talking to people and trying to figure out, okay, what do you care about? And it became pretty obvious early on. It's like, well, all of the people in my audience are like on Twitter and Hacker News. Most of them are developers. They're in developer circles. They like following other developer influencers, listening to developer podcasts, etc. So I should focus this on software engineers, not just all entrepreneurs, but mostly people who care about code, at least in the early days. And I should use Hacker News and Twitter and these developer influencers as my distribution channel. So before I even knew what the product was going to look like, I knew that like, here are my customers and here's where I'm going to reach them. Fast forward like a few weeks, I'd done like 10 interviews, which is pretty grueling. I had emailed like 140 people and almost all of them like just didn't reply or said no. Cause I was like, hey, will you share your revenue numbers with me? And they're like, who are you? No. And a few said yes. They're like the visionaries who are like, this is awesome. I wish I had this when I got started. And I put them all on one website and I emailed the moderators at Hacker News, which is a good hack. You could just email the mods and ask them like, hey, is it okay if I do a particular thing? Or, hey, I'm going to launch this thing next week. Do I have your blessing? It's very vague, but I think the moderator of any community just likes it when people in the community give them a heads up or when they talk to them about what they're doing, because it's hard to moderate a community. And I told them like, hey, I've got this thing. I interviewed 10 people. Like, is it okay if they all support me? I don't want to like vote brigade. I don't want to have a voting ring, but like they all were kind of my co-creators. So can we all upvote it? And the mods were like, yeah, sure. That sounds really cool. I like the project. It'll make Hacker News' front page even better. So for sure. So I just submitted it and I got 10 upvotes immediately because I emailed all the people I interviewed. And then from there, I think it just was at number 1 or number 2 for like 2 days straight, 100% because I built the interviews and the product from the ground up based on what I saw people on Hacker News already liked. So I wasn't really guessing what people in this audience or this distribution channel cared about. Like I had proof based on all the other posts and comments they'd made over the years. And I just worked backwards from there to figure it out. So I think, whenever you can, get out of your own head and do less like guessing or speculating on what people want. And when you can do more like looking for real world proof of how the people have behaved in the past, that is a really good indicator for how to do something that resonates. And ideally, if you have a clear vision of who your target customer is, because it's so easy to build a product and then say, okay, yeah, later on, I'll figure out who's going to use this, right? Which is kind of like Seth Godin calls it, like, you know, crafting a key and then walking around to every door in the world trying to find the perfect lock. And like, that's really hard to do. But if you find the lock first and then craft the perfect lock for that key, if you understand who your customers and your users are, then it becomes much easier to figure out, okay, well, like, are these people who talk to each other and share tips and recommendations? Because if so, like, it's much more likely I'll build something that grows via word of mouth. And if they don't talk to each other, then it's hard to grow via word of mouth. And like, do they follow particular influencers or post on particular forums? If so, then like, I know exactly where to go to reach them. And if they don't, then like, it's going to be really hard to reach them. And if you find like a particular customer segment that you want to target that doesn't check any of these boxes, then like right in the beginning, before you've written a single line of code or built anything, you can say, okay, this is not a good segment to target. I'm going to go after somebody who's easier to get in touch with and easier to reach.
Incredible. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for the great question.
Your podcast is actually the only podcast I'm like listening all the time. I regularly listening, and I even like go back and listen previous podcasts. So I consider you a bit like a podcast god. So what would your startup podcast guide be? What do you think are the best practices, or what makes you different, or what would you advise to someone who starts a podcast? Because we're actually starting this with my startup.
Cool. I think lots more people should start podcasts, but you got to be in it for the long haul. It's very hard to succeed if you're not consistent, and it's very easy to quit. Like, I wanted to quit after like 4 episodes, and then after 10 episodes, and then after 20 episodes, especially if your downloads aren't growing. You're just like, screw this, I'm out. So I'd say be consistent. But beyond that, like, I have kind of the same mental framework for pretty much anything. Like, I look at literally everything as a business. Daniel Gross, who runs Pioneer, he looks at everything as a game. He came on the podcast, and like, I talk to him every now and then, like outside of the podcast. And for him, everything in life is a game. And for me, like, it's all a business. And so I analyze it the exact same way, right? Who is your target market? What do they care about? What have they, like, you know, not what do they tell you they want? Like, what have they proven through their behavior in the past that they want? Like, what have they reacted to? Like, I could ask somebody, oh, who do you want to hear on the podcast? And they'll say things like, oh, I want to hear more failure stories, and I want to hear more stuff like that. And then I look at like past episodes and other shows that have tried that, and none of them have any like upvotes or downloads. So it's like, for me, not so much about asking people what they want. It's more about finding proof of what people want and just working backwards from there. So for the Indie Hackers podcast, like, I was pretty lucky that I had already figured out the formula by doing interviews on the website for 6 or 7 months before I even started the podcast. And then it was literally just the exact same formula, but, you know, transported over to audio, which is a little different because it's more dynamic, it's less predictable. But the same idea was in place, right? I want people who have inspiring stories, who've accomplished something great. I want to walk through their story in chronological order because as humans, we're just wired to like stories. I want to actually not gloss over the details, but like actually get into the strategies and the tactics, because I know my audience is technical and they're operators and founders, and they actually want the details because they're trying to struggle through these problems themselves. I know kind of like the broad checklist of problems that most indie hackers and founders face and the uncertainties they have. And I can go the interviewees into basically covering how they solve those problems. And I just think the formula was already figured out for me. So my advice to you, if you're going to start a podcast, is treat it like you would treat any business that you're starting. You want to validate your idea. You want to assess the market. Right now, like, we're in the middle of a podcast explosion. Even in 2016, it felt like that, but it's nothing compared to what it is today. There's a podcast for like anything and everything on earth right now. And I really wish people would do more unique things that really branch out and break the mold, because it seems like everybody just has like kind of the generic interview show, or everybody's got the like 2 founders talk about growing their business show, which is fine, but it gives listeners less of a reason to listen to your show in particular because they can get it anywhere else. It's almost like being an employee, right? Where it's easy for a company to fire you or pay you less if you have a very neatly packaged set of skills that they can hire anyone else for. And so you want to be unique and provide unique value to people. And I think to do that, you should look for inspiration elsewhere. Like, look out of the tech industry. Barstool Sports has an incredible podcast network. And I'm not a fan of theirs, but like, I'll go look at their shows and see what they're doing. And they just have like the most random stuff, and it's almost always entertaining. You know, they have a show where their founder just goes around and eats pizza and just riffs on the world. I'm building kind of a podcast network for indie hackers right now, and I'm looking for people with unique shows. And almost no one has a unique show. Like, I just found a cool one called Run With It, where they'll take a founder who's already running a successful business, and they'll bring them on the show and say, hey, give us a random idea for our audience. and then we're just going to like hate on your idea or like, talk about your idea and just like discuss and have fun with it. And it's really entertaining. It's really unique. It's really helpful to the audience, because one of the biggest problems that, aspiring founders have is they don't know what idea to work on, and they don't know how to evaluate an idea. So they get to hear from a new entrepreneur who gives them an idea and helps evaluate it in front of them every day. That's super helpful. It's super unique. It's hard to unsubscribe from that podcast once you subscribe, because like, where are you going to get that anywhere else? There's not very many other shows. So I would say focus on being unique, being consistent. And then there's some other like kind of less intuitive things about podcasts. People don't like listening to stilted, awkward conversations. So you want your conversations to flow. That might mean you need to do a lot of editing. That might mean you need to bring on people who are just like socially skilled, to the exclusion of others. Number two, I think, is any sort of content producer, you're a curator. You don't want to give people everything you produce. You want to give people the best stuff that you produce. They're coming to you because they don't want to waste their time searching through a bunch of stuff they don't like. So if you record a bad episode, scrap it or re-record it. I do that all the time. Like my second most downloaded episode, we re-recorded it 4 times. And it was my best friend, so she was like willing to put up with it. But I think people underestimate the degree to which like really great creators throw away stuff that's not good, and you only present what is good. Be consistent, which I already mentioned. Realize that like a lot of podcasting is just entertainment. People are bored and looking for something to do, and they want to learn. Like the number of insights per minute you can deliver is very helpful, but the conversation like should flow, and it should be remarkable, and there should be interesting stuff going on. And then the last thing I'll say is, in my experience, at least, podcasts grow through word of mouth. There's so many things that people want to do on Twitter. We're sharing all these snippets and videos and all sorts of stuff. And like people who are browsing Twitter are usually not in the mood to listen to a podcast, or they're not in a situation where they can immediately say, let me listen to an hour-long podcast. And so I've never found any sort of promotional anything that really worked to boost download numbers. Only word of mouth has worked. I've had episodes that got 1,000 likes and 300 retweets and got very few downloads. And I've had episodes that got like 10 retweets or 1 retweet and got like 100,000 downloads. So it's just about episode quality. It's about episodes that people are going to share with their friends or listen to 5 or 10 times.
Got it. Cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Good luck.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for doing this. It's nice to meet you. Working on Taskable, we aggregate all your tasks, communications, and information, put it in a single view, and help you plan and prioritize your day. I'm currently in St. George, Utah, of all places, outrunning the smoke in California.
Nice.
So yeah, sort of random. I'm a member of a bunch of communities, like, Slack communities, things like that. I'm always blown away by how helpful and generous people are with their time on Indie Hackers. I'm just wondering what you think sort of the secret is to why that's the case, and how do you maintain such a positive community when there's a lot of examples of communities that can become toxic or maybe less helpful or maybe a bit more antagonistic? Is there like sort of a secret to that success and how you do that?
Yeah. So I got a similar question earlier, but I'll try to answer it differently this time. So I think part of it is just everybody in Indie Hackers has skin in the game. There's not a community of people just watching others build products. It's a community of people who are building businesses and who therefore can like empathize with what you're up to. And when you come to the community and get help, and it's free, and you didn't pay anything for it, it just gives you this feeling of like, oh, I want to pay it forward most of the time. And so if you see someone else you can help, you're more likely to help them. And so I think controlling who's in your community and making sure that it's people who understand and empathize with others in the community is super helpful, rather than being kind of like, there's a lot of communities that are like one to many, where there's like, one person on the stage and a lot of people watching, or a very small number of people on the stage and a lot of people watching. Whereas Indie Hackers is more just like a crowd of everybody doing the same thing. Beyond that, I think I like to think of community and digital products in general just as like analogs of the real world. I think it helps because we evolved in the real world, and it's hard to make sense of all sorts of digital products. If like you had to build like a cup in real life, there was a great blog post on this years ago, but like you would never make like a cup that was like 1,000 pounds. You'd be very obvious to you that it doesn't work. But when you're making digital products, sometimes it's not obvious that like you're adding way too many features and it's way too bloated. And I think the same is true of a community, right? In a real world community, like it's obvious to you that like you want people to be kind of in the same place at the same time. And like those are two of the dimensions that matter. And you want people who have like similar skill sets, et cetera. But when people go digital, they're just like, oh, I'm going to build a forum or throw everybody in a Slack room and have no real rules or processes, or like, I'm not going to care about the time that people gather. I'm not going to care about the prompts, et cetera. So I think a lot about that. I hired an excellent community manager, Rosie Sherry, who's built her own community from the ground up, and she thinks a lot about that. And we try to do a lot to kind of like stoke the flames. Like we post, helpful and informative discussions that like get people saying positive things. We try to lead by example, because I think people tend to copy others that they admire. People more than anything copy what they see working. And so often we'll see on the community, if somebody does a particular type of post that's very distinct and memorable and it does really well, for the next 2 or 3 weeks, we'll see a lot of copycat posts that are just kind of like that. And so we try to shape the posts that do the best to make sure that when people copy them, they're doing it in a positive light rather than a negative light. We'll email people in the community and say like, hey, you've got this cool story and it's kind of hidden away here. Like, why don't you make a post about it in this way? And they will. And then a lot of it is just like incremental building on what works. So a long time ago, like we noticed people kept making these posts about like, please review my landing page. And then we made like a landing page feedback tag and that did well. And then we started doing, we switched over to groups and that was doing well. And we did like kind of a landing page feedback day and that did really well. And so a lot of it is like, I would never predicted or guessed that that was a way that people could find a lot of value, but it is. And instead of rejecting it or ignoring it, like we just sort of make it a first-class citizen and really lean into it. So there's no one trick, but I think if anything, was the most important, I would say it's just people having skin in the game and people, following the examples of others.
Cool. Thanks for that.
Yeah. Thanks for being a part of Indie Hackers.
What are the biggest mistakes that you see indie hackers making when trying to get things off the ground?
Yeah. There's so many. I mean, this is why it's hard to give advice because everyone has different mistakes and everyone's like stuck in a different feedback loop, which might be negative or might have different walls that they're running into. And so you give advice and then like, it turns out it doesn't apply to like 80% of people, but for 20% of people, it's like really salient. So I'll just like say a few of the things that I've seen. A lot of people just don't get started. Getting started is table stakes. You're better off starting with something really crappy and small that doesn't matter than sitting around waiting for the perfect idea to strike. In fact, some of my favorite indie hackers, Peter Levels, who created Nomad List, Tobias Van Schneider, who was like the head designer at Spotify. He's like really the single person who's responsible for Spotify's look. And he now runs a SaaS company called Simplease, which is really crushing it. Like both of them are prolific makers and both of them really believe in just working on really stupid, unambitious things that they're passionate about and then throwing it away if it doesn't work. And they both have folders, like they've shown me on Zoom, like directories on their computer of thousands of projects they've started and never told anyone about. And they're really dumb things. And like a few of them blew up and did really well. And so that's like one model I think works for people who have trouble getting started. Just keep your expectations low and start something. For people who do start, there's a whole other breed of people who start like too many things and none of them catch on. And they're not really, in my opinion, iterating and learning from their past mistakes. So I think you need to give things room to breathe. I did a podcast on YC and I think they called it like your whole goal is not to quit. And I believe that wholeheartedly. Like the number one cause of business failure is quitting. And quitting is caused by all sorts of things, but like you have to give your projects, your ideas, your features, like time for success, which means you have to be resilient. And, it sounds like a meaningless platitude and pretty generic, but it's so true that like if you quit before you've tried everything or the most promising things, like you're just never going to find success. There's so many things I tried with indie hackers that didn't work. And there's so many founders I've talked to who've tried things that didn't work and they just kept going and found other ways to make it work because your first guess is usually not going to be right. So I think too many people quit early and, kind of a corollary to that is too many people fail to construct an environment that allows them to not quit. So if you, for example, quit your job with like 3 months of runway in the bank, well, like you're going to have to quit working on your project in 3 months. Now, it would be much better is if you kept working at your job and you found a way to like take the excess salary you're making and like hire a developer to help you build your product. And you can maintain that indefinitely and not quit, or like some other way that you could figure out how to make it so like your environment's not going to force you to have to quit your project after a certain period of time. Also, people like working on projects that they don't even enjoy. That's another reason why people quit, because then things get hard and they're so focused on the end goal. Like I want to build something that changes the world and makes me a boatload of money, but they don't realize that the whole process needs to be fun. Otherwise, when it's hard, you're just going to, give up before you get to the end goal. So I think people structuring their companies in ways that don't make them happy is a huge mistake. What else? I think there's having the wrong mental model for what a company or a business is can really be a hindrance. A lot of people think about businesses as inventions, and an invention is kind of this thing you have to come up with and a flash of insight, and it's got to be unique and different than everything that's come before, and you got to keep it secret. And if you take that model to the business world, you're going to get burned because businesses don't need any sort of flash of insight. A business idea doesn't need to be unique or never before done. It doesn't need almost any of the things that an invention needs. Most of the businesses that we frequent every day are, and to some degree, clones of existing ideas or incremental improvements on existing things that already were out there. and they got released in some sort of MVP format, and just the founders iterated on them. And, maybe they innovated in one area, but in most areas, their businesses are pretty conventional. So if you look at a company like Stripe, yeah, like it brought payment processing to the masses, but like its real innovation was like being super developer focused. And there are other ways to process payments before Stripe. And so I would say like, don't look at a business as an invention, but like really figure out like what people already want, what people already need, and then just like innovate in one or two ways. Like, innovate in like the niche you target and add special features that help a particular group of people, or innovate on your distribution channel and like make your product available to people who frequent some channel that, previously would never have seen a similar product, or innovate on your market, bring like a same product to a different group, but don't like think you need some brilliant flash of insight and everything has to be amazing. Because it really doesn't. And I could go on. There's probably a million mistakes that people make. Another good one is like trying to do too much yourself. I think it's important to understand like what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are, and focus on your strengths. This is something I struggle with. I'm a kind of a perfectionist, and being a perfectionist usually means like you focus on like your weaknesses and you focus on what's bad, and you try to remove all the blemishes, because once you remove all the blemishes, like, and something's blemish free, then it's perfect. But perfect is not the same thing as great. Like you can have something that's blemish free. Like if I go outside and like paint a wall perfectly, and it's like the most perfectly painted wall anyone's ever seen, like, okay, it's perfect, but it's not great. It doesn't do anything for anyone. It's not like amazing. It's better to, I think, double down on your strengths rather than papering over your weaknesses. Figure out what you're good at and just create something great there. And if the rest of your product sucks or your business is kind of crappy, that's fine. Right? Every great business has things that are crappy about it. Stripe, Airbnb, Google, Facebook, like all have mountains of technical debt and all sorts of crappy code that's like still being rewritten to this day. And like, it's easy to hear those stories and think, oh, well, here's why I'm going to do it better. I'm going to make sure I don't have any technical debt. But like, I think that's the opposite lesson you should come away with. You should come away with the lesson that, hey, these companies had all these mistakes and still made it big, which means that focusing on these little mistakes is not the key to winning. It's really doubling down on your strengths. So what makes you great. That's the key to winning. So I think, that's a pretty big mistake founders can make, is getting obsessed with trying to do all the things perfectly and not accepting that when you're just one or two people, a lot of stuff's going to be crappy, and that's fine as long as you've got something that's really worth it.
Awesome. Thanks.
How do you leverage online communities to get traction? So you, for instance, used Hacker News.
Yeah.
I've been trying to use Reddit for, diabetic, weight loss, nutrition channels, but a lot of them have rules against self-promotion. So how do I work around that?
So this is like a good example of when you need to work backwards. If you really want to use a community to get your audience going, which I think is a great way to get started, because communities are like these prepackaged audiences that other people have built, and then they can just become your audience, which is magical. You don't have to start from scratch. But like, as you said, communities all have rules, and they have regulations, and they have constraints. And in my opinion, these are actually good things, because they constrain like the infinite possibilities you have down to like a few set of choices. It just makes your decision making easier as long as you're working backwards. So if you're like, hey, I've got this thing, I'm going to write this kind of promotional post, let me jam it into every community I can, then I think it's not going to work, because you're just not working backwards. But if you're like, hey, let me see which communities are the best. Okay, now let me go there. And all these communities have like a huge history. You can scroll back for years and years and see what people have upvoted, what people like. And like, that's the best evidence you could ever have as an entrepreneur. Like, you have all this stuff that just tells you proof positive, like, here's what succeeds here. And then you should work backwards from there to craft your product and your message to fit into the shape of this particular container. So with Indie Hackers and Hacker News, like, it wasn't an accident that I was doing these transparent interviews with founders. It was because I would go read all these Hacker News threads, and like, every one of these threads where somebody would ask, what's your one-person SaaS startup? But have like 300 comments, and the ones that got voted to the top every single time fit a particular format and structure. And so I just copied that structure for the ones that succeeded, and looked at all the comments of people who responded and who asked for more questions. And I made sure that like I did what people there wanted, so the people in the community would support it. That might look different with different subreddits, with different communities. A lot of things say, okay, you can't be self-promotional. Well, then don't be self-promotional, right? Maybe you do something that is giving more to the community than taking from the community. Maybe you share a lot of really good advice or feedback or learning. Maybe in the community, people talk about how much research they have to do to compile nutrition information, and you just go out and do a ton of research for them, and you do these little research dumps, and you say, hey, I'm going to post a research dump to this Reddit, every week, but like, I'm actually doing 2 or 3 a week, and you can come subscribe to my newsletter if you want more, right? or you just sign in with your name or your Twitter account or something. And like, that might be a way for you to sort of provide value to the community in a way that fits in with their rules, and a way that like you've seen, like they upvote a lot and they care a lot about, and also like siphon off some of that traffic and audience for yourself. So I think it depends a lot on your community, but you should always work backwards and work from what they want and what they already support, rather than trying to figure out like how you can jam your thing in the way that you want it to be.
Question from Emma from Vietnam, who can't connect via video or audio right now, but it's basically like motivation hacks. So when you did your first podcast in your 10th and you thought about quitting, for example, how would you get around that?
Motivation, big thing. BJ Fogg is like a behavioral researcher at Stanford. He's got a whole equation for behavior, like what gets anyone to do anything. And I think it's like something like motivation times ability times prompt. So motivation is like the first thing in that equation. It's really important. If you don't have the motivation to do something, like you're not going to do it. You also need to have the ability, and you also need like some sort of call to action, but like those are easier to get. Motivation's a tough one. When it comes to being a founder and being like kind of like a self-motivated person, I think one of the essential challenges is that like it's not the way society is structured. Like we're not really used to that, especially if you've worked a full-time job or you've gone to school. Usually you have all these external systems of motivation, like, train tracks or like guidelines that get you to do things. If you think about the fact that every day, 2 or 3 billion people wake up and go to work 9 to 5 and they're incredibly productive, maybe not incredibly productive, but like they do it reliably every day, year in and year out for their entire lifetime. Like that's a minor miracle. Like how is everybody so productive? And I think if you look at what's driving people, it's the fact that they have these frameworks, most of which are social. So social accountability is a huge one. Like if you have a boss who you respect and look up to, you don't want to let your boss down. If you have colleagues who you respect and who are depending on you, like you don't want to let your colleagues down. If you're providing a salary for your family to survive, like you don't want to let your family down. If your friends all respect you and think you're cool or smart, like you don't want to embarrass yourself by getting fired from your job. And so you have all of these like slightly uncomfortable social barriers when you're on like sort of the normal track to get up and do things every day, even if they're things that you don't necessarily want to do. But the second you become a founder, you quit your job and you're accountable only to yourself, you lose that motivational system. And I think it becomes much harder to do things when essentially the only thing pushing you forward is just pure willpower, because your willpower is not going to be constant. It's not going to be consistent every day. It's not this inexhaustible resource. And so what I've always done for Indie Hackers is I've always tried to have social accountability. The very first day that I launched Indie Hackers, I also launched my mailing list, and I made a commitment every mailing list. Here's what I will have done by next week. And within a week, it's like I have thousands of people who are like, okay, you said you're going to do this thing. Where is it? And it was uncomfortable. Like I wasn't happy every Thursday when I had to send my newsletter, because that meant on Wednesday I was going to be burning the midnight oil to get things coded and get things done, so I didn't embarrass myself in front of a lot of people. But Jesus, was it a good motivational hack. And I have never been as productive as I was in those like first few months when I was sending out updates with what I wanted to do every single week to a bunch of people. And if you don't have a bunch of people on a mailing list, like that's fine. Tell friends, get a mentor, get a co-founder or a partner, someone you can be accountable to and who you won't want to let down, I think is probably the biggest motivational hack that I know.
So hey, so I'm working on Oiku. It's a no-code platform for the creative class, including the podcasters. Basically, it allows podcasters to build Spotify like streaming apps for their shows without having to code, right? So my question is like, so I've been working with a lot of so amazing podcasters who are really passionate about the shows.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is like, so a lot of them, feels like, so they don't really kind of monetize the shows just yet. I mean, there's no ads, and so they don't really get the kind of so and the thing is like, so they're not very much also inclined towards putting premium content, right? So
yeah.
So to kind of so want to know your thoughts around the future of podcasting as to so how a podcaster so do you think that they would monetize, and so is that a how evolved would it be for podcasters to kind of say explore the idea of having premium content and some membership program sort of thing? So
yeah, I think the future is pretty bright for pretty much any content creator, especially people who want to make a living doing it, just because on one hand, content's kind of a commodity. Like anybody can produce content, anybody can produce a podcast or write a newsletter or do any of this stuff. But what's good about it is that it's not a winner take all market. Like there's no one podcast that's going to like take all the podcast listenership in the same way you see with social networks and a lot of the bigger stuff that comes out of Silicon Valley, where investors want to pile money into like basically markets where one person's going to take everything. And so this kind of like provides an arena where like indie hackers and people who have, slightly more modest ambitions can all compete and all do something that they like and find a niche and still succeed, even though there's like a million other people succeeding. So I'm pretty bullish on podcasts. I'm bullish on paid podcasts. I do think that podcasts in particular are cool because they're sticky. If you write something, unless you're a very distinct stylistic writer like Matt Levine or Paul Graham, it's kind of hard for people to understand, like to really see like your personal voice in what you're writing. But in a podcast, it literally is your voice. And like we're wired evolutionarily to be able to differentiate between different people's voices and personalities and speaking styles. Like I've been recognized out on the street before because I said a sentence and someone's like, I've heard your voice in a podcast. Like it's that distinct of a fingerprint. And so I think people end up identifying with you and become loyal and like don't unsubscribe or stop reading at the same rate as they would with like written content. If somebody's writing something and then somebody else writes something better, you might just say, okay, I'm going over there. But like if you become familiar and like, kind of like friends with the podcast that you're listening to, which happens, you kind of develop this loyalty and affinity to what they say. And they could say the same thing that someone else has said, but you like it better because it came from their mouth. So in terms of like what you're trying to do with your business, I think, trying to sell something to someone or even just get them to use something when it's not high on their priority list is a very hard task. People try to sell me stuff for my podcast all the time. And sometimes I use it and sometimes I don't. And almost always, like their ideas are good. Like almost always they have something that I'm like, oh, that is cool. I would like to do it. But running a podcast is a lot of time and a lot of work. And I also have like a million other responsibilities. Like I'm trying to code this social network basically by myself all day. And I've got a million emails and other podcasts and AMAs that I'm doing and meetings at Stripe and a team I'm trying to run, like a million things. So I can only really focus on like the top 2 things on my priority list for every area. And the rest, even if it sounds like a good idea, I have to say no. And so in terms of how that affects you, I think number one, you should think about your product and how high of a priority is what you're building for your users. If it's like 6th or 7th on their list, then it's not a high enough priority for them. And you got to figure out how to get it higher. But also like who are your users? Because different people have different priorities. And if it turns out like the people who are podcasting that you're talking to have cool shows and you like them and they like you, but like they're not that enthusiastic, like maybe you need to go after podcasters who are super serious. Like go after people who already have sponsors and who have quit their jobs to focus on their podcast. And podcasting for them is their entire life and their entire business. And for them, like they're going to be able to take care of their top 10 priorities because that's all they do. And it's super important to them. I think about this a lot at Indie Hackers because we're kind of building out kind of a media company in a way where we're like always trying to get people to write for us and make good contributions to the forum. And consistently, the people who do that the best, who always want to work with us, who are reliable and put stuff out consistently, are people who like attach their forum post to some other endeavor that's like their livelihood. They have a paid newsletter or something. And so they're always cranking out content and they're super easy to work with. And other people who are just kind of like, oh, I would like to write a post and have it featured. Maybe like they take forever to get back to us and they're not super serious and they don't put a lot of effort into it. So I would think about who your customers are. Maybe just go to some place like Patreon or YouTube or Substack and find people who are already making money and pitch what you're doing to those people first.
Right. I think absolutely. I mean, I think that's what our learning is. And I think, so what's happening is the guys who are really serious have more than one shows. They're kind of a mini network in themselves, so they have, so 2-3 other shows and, so they're making a regular income and stuff like that. So trying to gear towards that feature from a product perspective. And also we're connecting with Patreon to say, I mean, so if there's a case that, so people or creators who are already making money, that's where the right audience is for us. So.
Yeah, very cool. Sounds like you're on the right track. Another idea might be there's lots of like production companies and agencies that work with podcasters. Like I've got a producer. I pay him hundreds of dollars per episode to make my show sound great and edited and cut all sorts of stuff so I don't have to. They might be good partners because they're always looking for more scalable ways to make more money. They might want to do affiliate deals, and they're already working with lots of podcasters who are serious enough to pay them money for it. So that's another idea.
Right. I mean, I'm like personally, I mean, I've reached out, I think, so sent out 7 emails just this week.
Okay.
And, so I haven't heard back, but I think, so I'll need to kind of do more emails. So I'm trying to reach out with the reseller angle with these agencies basically. So, but I mean, we'll see how that goes. So.
Yeah. Keep sending emails, change up your email format. I'm much more likely to respond to emails when they're not like immediately right off the bat, like, let me sell you something. But when they seem like a fellow creator or worker who just wants to like shoot the shit with me and like discuss something or ask me how I do something. Like people like flattery. Like, oh, I really like how you edited this episode. Like, I've been trying to do this. What do you think? Blah, blah, blah. And they'll say whatever. And be like, yeah, I'm trying to do it for my podcast creation app. Oiku, check it out. Like, what do you think about this? And they're like, oh yeah, I'm an expert. Let me tell you what I think. And then next thing you know, they're like buying it. So I would say try all sorts of different sales tactics and emails. Don't give up. I sent so many hundreds of emails in the early days of Indie Hackers to get my first interviewees, and then another 100 emails to get my first sponsors. And it's surprising what works.
Sure thing, man. So I'll sure try that, so pitch my email. Thanks a lot.
Cool.
One question that I do have, which is quite particular to us really as people that are launching a new community soon, is that a lot of the communities that I see launching nowadays, they start off as content streams first, and then they sort of bolt on community later.
Yeah.
That does solve that chicken versus egg question quite well. But in our case, we're very much focused on launching as a community first. And yeah, I wonder if you had any advice on how you tackle that particular problem.
Yeah, I totally get it. I also did the content first, community later thing because I was doing the interviews and sending them out week after week. There wasn't a huge gap. It's like it took 3 weeks to launch Indie Hackers, then like a month and a half of sending out, new interviews every week. And then I started the community. The challenge with the community is this chicken and egg problem you mentioned. Nobody wants to be a part of a community that's dead, right? Like the value of a community is it's a thriving place where you can talk to lots of other people. And the problem is in the beginning, it's not a thriving place where you can talk to lots of other people. So it doesn't have value in the beginning. So you have to figure out a way to create that value. And the good thing about it is there's no objective measure. It's all relative. So earlier I was talking about like thinking about community as physical space. And the two most important things are time and a place. So if you look at real world communities, if you look at like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting, like that's a community. And like, well, how do they deal with time and space? Well, they meet like once a week in a small room with, chairs facing each other in a circle, and it's 10 people. And like, that's a fine community, even though it's only got 10 people who are only active 1 day a week. Now online, you might think, oh no, I got to have an ever present forum that's always on, or a Slack chat room that's like, anyone can connect at any point in time. But then you've just blown up the time that your community exists from some like very constrained amount of time to something that's always on, which is really hard to sustain and is always going to feel empty unless you have thousands of users. And similarly, like space is something you can deal with too. If you create a community forum, and I don't know what your community looks like, but like if you create a community forum that can show 35 different posts, but people are only making like 3 posts a day or a week, it's going to look dead and empty and not very valuable. Whereas if like your community is like, I don't know, a website where there's a big question up at the top, and every week the question changes and you just leave comments on that question, then it's going to look super active and lively because you've constrained the space just down to like something very simple where you don't need that many people to participate. So if I was going to start from scratch and I was going to build a custom community from the ground up and I wanted to do it without going content first and not having to like drive tons of eyeballs, I would just try to constrain the time and the space to something extremely small, get everybody ideally online looking at the same thing at the same time. And then even if you only have like 5 or 10 people, like you create a lot of buzz and excitement and you can grow incrementally from there. The alternative is if you do it like I did it, which was I didn't constrain the time and space at all. The Indie Hackers Forum was a forum like it looks like today. In the early days when there was no one, is you have to kind of fake it till you make it. So this is like the Reddit strategy. You make a lot of accounts, you start talking to yourself, you have all these conversations, and then you try to filter other people into it. That's a lot less fun, a lot less sustainable, a lot easier to give up on. And again, even if you do it that way, you still need like a big content machine because like, who are you going to funnel into this like faux community that you're constantly, propping up? So for me, that looked like sending a ton of emails to my newsletter with all these fake conversations and trying to get people into the door. And it took months to do. But if I were doing it your way and I can go back in time, I would just constrain the time, constrain the space, and then gradually expand it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. That's really great advice. One other quick question, just
Sure.
Curious about if you see any sort of obvious threats to Indie Hackers' continued success.
I mean, I think that unbundling is like in a way a threat. Indie Hackers theoretically unbundled Hacker News, right? Indie Hackers used to exist as like a kind of a small subset of Hacker News, or once or twice a week there'd be a discussion on a particular topic. Now I see significantly fewer Indie Hacker founder entrepreneur discussions on Hacker News because a lot of it happens on Indie Hackers. Theoretically, someone might do that to Indie Hackers itself. There might be lots of different niches, e-commerce entrepreneurs or crypto founders or community founders who create their own communities and their own interview shows that are much more niche and focused on those particular groups. And, it's death by 1,000 cuts. Why go to indie hackers when you can go directly to the thing that you want? Why read some really broad magazine that's very generalist? If you're a dirt biker, why not just go read like Dirt Bikers Express or some better magazine that appeals to your interests? So that's a potential threat. That being said, I think unbundling is also useful because ultimately, like on Indie Hackers, what happens a lot? People link to their Hacker News submissions and their Hacker News posts. And like we're sort of boosting Hacker News' profile. Like ultimately, there have been a lot of clones of Indie Hackers already. And like a lot of people there talk about the latest episode of the Indie Hackers podcast or what's at the top of the Indie Hackers forum right now. And so it's kind of cohesive. And I think as long as I'm kind of expanding the community and in sort of a judo move, like going with the flow rather than resisting it, things will be good. So right now, for example, we have a ton of different groups, and these groups are themselves their own communities. And a lot of them are big. Like our no-code group is like 17,000 members. And like I was the moderator of it for the last 6 months, barely moderating it at all. And people were just kind of doing free form stuff. So earlier this week, I was like, hey, who wants to moderate some of these huge communities on Indie Hackers that like I'm, faux moderating, but like really not paying attention to. And so now I've put those in the hands of like people who are deputized to like really grow these communities for their own sake and their own benefit. And I think it'll just be hard for others to like directly compete with that social sort of cohesion and all those social connections if they're trying to like build a massive community, just because again, community's value comes from like the liveliness and the people there, and Indie Hackers already has a lot of activity and a lot of people there. So I'm not super worried about competition. I think there are very few moats in business, but some of the strongest ones are like network effects, and Indie Hackers has a lot of network effects.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Thanks very much, Courtland.
Yeah, thank you. Good luck.
Yeah, my name is Yura. I'm from Ukraine. I work on Sherlock. It's internet for command line applications. So actually I have two quick questions. The first one is I have a lot of emails in my mailbox. Emails Courtland from Indie Hackers. Is it you who wrote all the content?
Yeah, some of them I write the content. Some of them I just kind of oversee the content. And it also depends on the date. Like the further back you go, the more likely it is that I actually wrote it. So if you're getting like the milestone emails, that's a kind of an automated list you can subscribe to that just shows you the top milestones posted by Indie Hackers that day. I don't write that. That's automated. Same with the community digest, like the top posts from like the groups that you subscribe to or the people you follow, assuming you've joined or followed any people or groups, like that's automated. But then we get like our Indie Hackers newsletter, which goes out once or twice a week now. And that'll be like a collection of stories. And each story in that newsletter is written by a different person, usually. And often that newsletter comes from like my brother, Channing at Indie Hackers. So he might write the intro and sign it Channing. Or I might write the intro and sign it Courtland. And then we might have an interview in there conducted by like Channing, or a podcast description that I wrote, or a really good post from the forum that somebody else wrote. And so we try to like sign each part of it based on who wrote it. And then there's like the welcome email, which you get when you join, which I did write, but I don't manually send it every single time somebody joins. But I did write it as if I was writing it to a friend, and I try to make it very personal, and I encourage anyone who gets it to respond. So it's an automated email, but like I send, hundreds of responses every month because people get it and actually respond and take me up on it and ask me questions. And like, I want to actually be there and see what people are working on and talk to them. So I think having a personal touch is good, but like you can't do everything. And the degree to which you can like delegate or automate stuff is super helpful, especially later on once you have like a pretty large community or a large following.
So if you will launch, let's say, e-commerce community today, what will you focus on?
For launching an e-commerce community, I don't know a ton about e-commerce. So the first thing I would focus on is like, who does know a ton about e-commerce, right? Let me find these people. There's all sorts of cool tools out there. SparkToro is a really great one that people are kind of sleeping on. But you can go there and you can literally put in like the name of a brand or the name of a website or the name of a Twitter account or just a topic name. And SparkToro will literally tell you like, people who visit this website, listen to these podcasts, follow these Twitter accounts, subscribe to these people on Instagram, do a lot of Google searching for XYZ. And I would just try to learn a lot about my market and who they hang out with and what they're up to. And, again, like I'm a big fan of not trying to find some super novel idea that no one's ever done before. I don't think that is really useful. I'm more of a fan of looking for proof in what people are already doing. And it's something I want to scream from the rooftops because I think not enough people will really get it. Like I would want to find out like where do people who read e-commerce content or participate in e-commerce communities, like what are they already talking about? Like what are they spending a ton of time and money on today, right now, already? And that'll be like proof positive for like the things that are most valuable to them, the things at the top of their priority list. And then I'll try to make sure my community met those needs. So if people in e-commerce communities were only like always just talking about like Shopify customer support, and that was like the number one topic of conversation, then I might think about making a community around that. There are some like distinct aspects of community that I think are universal if you want to have a thriving community. For example, you have to have your community based around a topic that people actually want to discuss. It's surprising how many times people create a community around something like they as a founder are interested in, but no one actually ever has conversations about it. So it needs to be something that people actually want to discuss, something that people don't like churn from. Like I actually wouldn't start a Shopify customer support community because like once you have a question and you get an answer, you churn. You don't need it anymore. Versus a community about like, I don't know, like a sports team. Guess what? That sports team is going to exist from here through the rest of time. They're always going to have new seasons and new controversy. Like you're never going to churn because the activity never ends. In other words, like it's a problem that people have or a desire people have to discuss this thing that literally can never be permanently fulfilled, which means like your churn is going to be pretty low. I have like a whole checklist actually of like evaluating a particular problem that I want to solve and whether or not it's a good problem we're solving. And I don't remember all the items off the top of my head, but it's kind of like reach, like how many people have this problem? Value, like how much have people proven that they want to pay either time or money or status or reputation to solve this problem? Frequency, how frequently do people have this problem? Is this something that people have every day, or is it a problem people have once a year, like filing taxes? Because that's going to control how often they use your product. If you're building a community and you want people there every day, your community needs to solve a problem that people have every day. And there's really nothing you can do to change people's visit frequency if it doesn't align with like the frequency of the problem they're experiencing. Like community cohesion, like how much do these people actually talk to each other and like each other? A lot of people will do stuff like, I'm building a to-do list for people who really want to connect, their Airtable to Google Docs. And it's like, well, that's cool, but like there is no community of people who want to connect Airtable to Google Docs. Like these people don't know each other. There's no potential for word of mouth spread. Like it doesn't make any sense. Whereas like if you're building a tool for like teachers, guess what? Like teachers talk to each other and share product recommendations and hang out after school. And so you can grow much more easily if you build something for like a cohesive community. I already mentioned kind of retention, like solving problems that like never really end, that don't have an end in mind. Like Indie Hackers does that. Founders never, get to the point where they're like, you know what? I never need to learn anything about running a company again. So I'm solving a problem where people, perpetually have that problem. There's a whole bunch of other stuff if you really think about it. So I would work backwards from the community and from the target market and understanding their problem and try to like solve a problem that I thought was really valuable and lasting and frequent and all those good things.
Thank you. Very insightful.
Yeah, good luck.
Courtland, thank you so much. This has been fantastic. Really appreciate you coming in.
Yeah, had fun. Feel free to ping me on Twitter or I'm super slow at email. It might take me like a month or two to respond, but I'm Courtland at indiehackers.com. Much more responsive on Indie Hackers itself. So if you ever make a post there, feel free to tag at CS Allen. I'm happy to chime in and contribute. And finally, if anyone ever wants to start a podcast targeted at indie hackers or founders, I'm trying to grow a podcast network. So if you do something cool or unique, send it my way and I'll take a look and try to help promote you and get the word out about your show.